Soldier's Heart by Gary Paulsen. Chapter 3. Toward Manassas. He thought he would remember the train ride forever. Most of the men had never been on a train, and certainly few of them had been on one this plush. The seats were soft and cushiony, and the food, especially compared to the rough fare at Fort Snelling, was delicious. They rode across Wisconsin and down into Chicago, and everywhere they stopped, there were huge crowds gathered to cheer them on. Girls gave them hankies and sweets, and Charlie figured later he had fallen in love at least a dozen times. The country didn't change much at first, and it was still all Union. They made their way, sleeping like lords and eating like kings, Charlie thought, across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and down into Maryland. And there were crowds all the way, even when the train didn't stop. Charlie saw his first coloreds when they moved into Maryland. They looked poor and had poor clothes, and he thought about slavery then and how it must be strange to own a person, so they had to do what you wanted. He'd never considered it before and wondered what would happen after the war when the Union had whipped the rebels. Would they be allowed to keep their slaves? The war wasn't initially about slavery. The troops were going to stop the lawbreakers and wrong thinkers that were trying to bust up the Union. They talked about it at night while the train moved east and south, and never did they speak of slavery. Just about the wrong-headedness of the Southern crackers and how they had to teach Johnny Reb a lesson. A woman of color came up to him when the train was stopped in Maryland, just before Baltimore, and handed him a sweet roll and said, "Thank you for what you're doing. I hope God keeps you safe from harm and brings you back to your family." She was crying. Charlie thanked her and ate the cake and smiled at her and wondered why she was crying and wanted to ask why she was glad he was going to fight the South. She was, after all, part of the South. But they had to reboard the train then, and he never found out why the colored woman was crying. He did see as the train moved off that a white woman came out of the house and grabbed the colored woman by her dress and dragged her back inside. Then she turned and shook her fist at the train. "She's a Reb," he thought, and it surprised him, though he didn't know why he should be surprised that a woman who owned another person would be a Reb. They were in Maryland and had been warned to watch out for rebels and their sympathizers. But it was still his first experience with a Southerner. He watched the house from the open window as the train pulled away, hoping for another sight of the woman. Now the country was changing. There had been farms all along and towns, but the trees seemed more spaced here, the pastures more open, and Charlie began to see poor farms. He heard the men talking about them, the poor whites, but he still wasn't quite ready for the sight when the train slowed for a hill and passed a shack that was little more than boards tacked to some poles. The children running around out front were only half clothed, and a man and a woman were sitting in rags. All the soldiers talked about the poor white trash and how these were the people they had come to fight, people who couldn't get out of their yards, let alone fight a proper army. It made him very conscious of his own home. Even without a father there, the house was in good shape and kept up, and there was a well-tended garden, good food, clothes that covered bodies. He wondered how the rebels thought they could fight a war when their people couldn't dress themselves. It made him sad to see the children barely clothed. What would happen to them in winter? They did not have much of a winter here, he knew. Nothing like Minnesota's. But it would still be cold. He turned from the window just as a man next to him, a private named Swenson, said, "You could throw a cat through their house without hitting a wall." "They don't have anything," Charlie said. "Not a thing." The man nodded. "This ain't going to be much of a war. I don't see how they can fight. They don't have any clothes." Heck, it'll probably be over before we get to Washington, Swenson said. And Charlie nodded, but stopped talking because he did not like profanity, even of a low order. And there was much of it around. He thought of a surgeon who had spoken to them and told them to try to wear clean clothing going into battle, in case they were hit by a rifle ball. If the cloth was carried into the wound, clean cloth would cause less infection. He had thought of it and taken a bullet from one of the paper cartridges and pushed it against his sleeve. It didn't seem possible that the bullet could be made to go through the sleeve, into him, carrying the fabric with it. He thought it must be the same with profanity and immoral thinking. Charlie believed in heaven and hell and God and Jesus and wanted to be with God if he was killed. If he had profane thoughts as he went to war, they might infect his soul, as the dirty clothes would infect his wound. And while he did not think he would die, did not think he would even be hit or hurt, did not think of it at all, still, it was best to be careful. He stared out the window and thought of all the things he would tell his mother and his brother Orrin when he wrote the next letter. "I'm a man now," he would write, "and seeing and doing a man's things out in the world. I've seen things you wouldn't believe." He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the gentle rocking of the train take him to sleep. Chapter 4, Bull Run. "Make it stop now," Charlie thought. Or thought he was thinking until he realized he was screaming it. "Make it all stop now!" Death was everywhere, nowhere. Bullets flew past him with evil little snaps and snickers as they cut the air. Next to him, Massey's head suddenly left his body and disappeared, taken by a cannon round that then went through an officer's horse, end to end, before plowing into the ground. "This can't be," he thought. "I can't be here. This is all a mistake, a terrible mistake. I'm not supposed to be here." He had forgotten to fire. The officers had marched them out into a field in perfect order and told them where to aim and fire, and he had raised his rifle, and then the whole world had come at him. The rebel soldiers were up a shallow grade 100 yards away, behind some fallen trees, and they had opened on Charlie and the others before anyone could fire. It was like a blade cutting grain. He heard the bullets hitting the men, little thunk slaps, and saw the men falling. Some of them screamed as they fell. Most were silent. Many were dead before they hit the ground. Many were torn apart, hit 10 or 12 or more times before they had time to drop. The men left standing with Charlie fired. Then the survivors of that round reloaded and fired again. And Charlie aimed in the general direction of the rebels and pulled his trigger, firing blind. The black powder smoke clouded from the rifles and the rebel guns on the hill, and it was impossible to see or to understand anything. "I don't know anything," Charlie thought. The words jerked through his mind before he thought them. Somebody screamed over the sound of the gunfire, and the man next to Charlie turned to the rear and began walking away as calm as if he was going for a stroll in a park, his rifle at right shoulder heft. Charlie followed him, dragging his own rifle along the ground. "He must know something I don't know," he thought, "must have heard something." But the man hadn't gone 4 steps before he was struck in the back several times and dropped on his face. Bullets filled the air. Charlie heard them going past his ears like horizontal hail, and he decided to lie down. If he didn't lie down, he would be hit, ripped, torn to pieces. It was only slightly better on the ground. He heard the same sounds, the same bullets, but the bodies in front of him protected him. He could hear bullets hitting them. 2 bullets met directly in front of his eyes, jammed together, and fell to the ground as one. That sight was more horrifying than the death he'd seen. How many bullets, he thought, would have to be flying around for two of them to collide in midair? Something jerked at his foot, pulling it sideways. He was sure he'd been hit, didn't see how it was possible to keep from being hit. But when he turned, he saw Lieutenant Olafson tugging at his leg. The officer had been hit in his left upper arm. He was still holding a saber in his left hand and was jerking at Charlie with his right. "Get up, boy! We're to fall back!" The cords in his neck bulged with the strain of screaming over the noise. "Back? In good order, we're to fall back to the trees. Come on, son, up now and move. Help some of the others." Somehow, Charlie's arms worked to push him off the ground. He stood and started walking when everything in him wanted to run. Started walking in good order, even when the lieutenant was hit in the chest and head and went down, obviously finished, but with legs still moving, still pumping, still pushing the dying body around and around on the ground. Charlie started walking, not running, even when his mind prayed to God, told God, demanded of God. "I am not supposed to see this, God. No person is supposed to see this. How can you let this happen?" Charlie walked amid the explosions of shot and the ripping of bullets until he was clear of the smoke and saw other men walking with him. Impossible, he thought, that they could walk as they did, in rank. Impossible that they had lived, could have lived through what had come at them, was still coming at them. Many of the men crouched as they moved, as if in a heavy rain, and Charlie found himself doing the same. And when he was still some 20 yards from the line of trees ahead, he crouched more and then ran, could not stop himself from running until he was there in the trees, a large maple at his back, and finally sucking air until his lungs seemed to be on fire. Finally he stopped and leaned over, his hands on his knees, and vomited, heaving until he was empty, and then heaving more, until he felt as if his stomach would come up, until he felt his very soul would leave him.